Is that better? Okay. Morning. My name is Cian Richardson. I'm a student at the University of Westminster, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panel this morning. I welcome you to the Thematic session on Sustainable Development Goal 2, which promotes to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. As moderator for the panel, we have Ms. Jennifer Hogge Ellsworth, who is the Executive Director of Engage Now Africa. The panelists include Ms. Louise Camara Manoel, Executive Leadership, Strategic Planning, Disruptive Innovation and International Development, a mouthful, and Yvonne Nsabimana, the Executive Director of Ngoma Africa Cultural Centre, and Rebeca Rios, Kohn, author, human and children rights activist at Arigatou International. We won't have any time for detailed introductions, but please see the bios on the websites if you want to know more about the panelists. And I turn to Ms. Hogge Ellsworth. Thank you.
Thank you. As I look out over the audience, I see friends and family, and how grateful we are that you are all here with us to talk about such an important issue as hunger. It is nice to know that there are people near and far who are dedicated to looking at this issue in a thoughtful way, and in a way that perhaps could offer solutions to some of the thoughts on your mind as you think about and work in your various capacities on this issue of global hunger. We have a panel of experts here for you to listen to, and I've spent quite a bit of time with most of them to hear and to learn about their dedication to this issue of global hunger. You will enjoy what they have to say, and we are grateful that you are here and concerned about these issues. I thought for the next hour, how we would like to lay this out is I'll spend some time talking just a little bit about the statistical problem behind global hunger, to allow you all to refresh your memory on what some of those problems are. And then we'll turn the time over to Rebeca, Louise, and Yvonne, who again have deep expertise in their area, and allow them to take about 5 minutes each and talk about what they do. As our student said, their bios are hooked to their online picture, so please look over their bios. This discussion is going to be focused on hunger and how their various organizations that they're involved with are dealing with this global issue. And then we would like to make the remainder of the time, the last 45 minutes or so, open to questions for you. I have a set of questions that I'll ask. I'll probably start us out with some questions, and then I'll turn to the audience, to you, and ask you to ask some questions of our panelists. And then I will ask a couple of other questions. So we'll go back and forth. I have some questions, and then I'll look to you. You'll notice here there's a microphone. Please feel free to ask your question there. And if I could gently remind you and encourage you, instead of making statements, to ask your question precisely, and to be thoughtful of your other audience members who might also have questions, and to allow as many people as we can to ask their questions about global hunger. So on that note, let me take just a moment and say, again, my name is Jennifer Hogge. I'm the Executive Director of Engage Now Africa. We work in sub-Saharan Africa on poverty eradication issues in Ghana, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Namibia, and Uganda. We're focused on public health issues, education issues, modern slavery, eradication of modern slavery. We deal with hunger every day in our organization. And so this is an issue I think you will find that is near and dear to all of our hearts. As a reminder, let me just read you a couple statistics as I was preparing for the panel that I think that you will find quite sobering. 828 million people go to bed hungry every night, according to the World Food Program. Those facing acute food insecurity have soared from 135 million to 345 million people since 2019. 50 million people in 45 countries are teetering on the edge of famine. That's a lot of our brothers and sisters throughout the world who go to bed every night wondering what it will be the next day for them in terms of hunger. Some of the hot spots of hunger are in Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Yemen. Those are the 5 or 6 countries that remain on the highest alert as hotspots and catastrophic conditions, a seedbed for famine. Last year, 140 million people suffering from acute hunger came from 10 countries: Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Haiti, Nigeria, Pakistan, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. 60% of the world's hungry live in conflict, in zones affected by conflict, which conflict is one of the main drivers of acute food insecurity. And we'll be talking and hearing a little bit more from our panelists. And on that note, I'll turn the time over to Rebeca. We'll let you take your 5 minutes, and then Luis, and then Yvonne, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to share with you what we do at Arigatou International, which is an NGO established by Japanese Buddhists over about 30 years ago to work exclusively for children's rights and to support the work that's being done by other partners as well in the area of children's rights and well-being. So it's a very tall order, very challenging, as you can imagine. But we have offices in different parts of the world, and we sustain a network called the Global Network of Religions for Children, because we understand that faith communities are critical in improving the situation of children. They are the first responders at the grassroots on any given issue. So it's critical for us to not only engage them, but also give them the capacity to work more effectively. And we do this in an interfaith manner, all right? So I could speak a lot about how we do this, and it gets to be quite long. So I just want to cut to the issue of hunger. This global network of religions for children, they're all volunteers. Imagine that they're all volunteers working at the country level, sometimes at the very grassroots, and we have been privileged to collaborate with UN agencies on this issue, like UNICEF, UNDP, and others, because we know we can't do this alone, and we're a very small organization. But there had not existed this global network of religions for children, and when it was established, there was a lot of excitement by many, many people, and it was a paradigm shift in a way, because it's not always clear to people how important it is to work with faith communities in the development context. And there was a gap between human rights work and development practitioners. There was a big gap in understanding the need for better collaboration. But having said that, I want to jump to the Millennium Development Goals, which came before the Sustainable Development Goals. Those were 8 goals, and goal number 1 was to address poverty and hunger. It was all in one goal, and now we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and now we have a goal number 2 to end hunger. So our approach is to engage the faith communities, to work on issues of poverty, on issues of hunger, in fact, most of the Sustainable Development Goals are necessary to address. They're all interrelated, interconnected, and so we don't look at them in silos or in a vacuum. We have to look at the holistic approach to ending hunger, and also the structural issues and challenges that cause this. Because I'm reminded of a Holocaust survivor who wrote, Primo Levi, and when I was at UNICEF, I spent many years at UNICEF, and he would quote Primo Levi many times, just to paraphrase, that we have the capacity to change the situation. So we have a moral obligation to do something about it. And I'm really paraphrasing. But we at Arigatou feel that we have a moral obligation to change the situation of children everywhere. But I mentioned the Millennium Development Goals because I was quite depressed when I realized that we're not achieving the Sustainable Development Goals for all kinds of complex issues like conflict, like climate change, which is also affecting structural change, challenges and so forth. It's a very complex issue. But in fact, we do have the capacity. We do have the capacity to change things. And just 2 days ago, as I was thinking about coming here to this wonderful place where we are all like-minded activists, I think, I look at my phone, and the first thing the BBC says on that morning says, a woman in Somalia, which is undergoing a famine right now in Somalia, a woman in Somalia died, and she was not able, from starvation, and she was so weak, she dies, but she was not able to bury her child, who had also died from the famine in the country, in that region. So it's very troubling to me that we have the capacity to make a difference, to change things, but we need everyone to work together at all levels, at all sectors. And I'll stop there because there are other speakers, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you to the university for bringing us all together. You know, if there's any applause to be held, I think it's organizations like UVU and the UN that are the agents of change, that bring to pass effective change and productive dialogue. This is a big deal. I surmise that if Maslow were to be alive today, and if he were sitting in this panel, he would say that this SDG by far is the most important of all. Because this is about a very existential question that many families today are dealing with. And they are not so different than us. 1 in 3 children in the world are suffering from some form of undernourishment or malnutrition. 1 in 3. You are likely to know them. They're not just in the streets of Uganda or Sierra Leone. They are here too. And we can do something about it. And it starts with events like this. It starts with awareness. It starts with passion. It starts with a sense of mission. And it's not just a Christian duty, although it is also part of that, but it is a human duty. It's our human duty to do something about it, to know that we can do something about it. I love so much of what you said. I love this idea of holistic approach. Ecosystemic problems require ecosystemic solutions. Hunger is an ecosystemic problem. Food insecurity is an ecosystemic problem. It is not about driving a truck full of food supplements or foodstuffs and driving that truck back out and expecting to solve the problem within 2 weeks. It requires sustained support. It requires learning. It requires capacitation of local communities. It requires engagement not only at governmental levels, and most certainly we have reason to be optimistic because governments and NGOs and communities of faith or secular organizations are learning to work together, and they're starting to do so in very effective ways. And for that reason, we have a reason to be optimistic. There's wonderful work happening. And COVID, conflict, and climate change has impacted and has set us back a few years. But the good news is that we have not forgotten. We still know how to do this. And as we re-engage our partners, as we bring to the table, especially local communities. I was just having a delightful conversation right before this panel started with a wonderful woman who leads a women's organization in Uganda. And it's women like her that make sustainable change happen. Not big institutional donors, not big organizations, and yes, we all play a role in that to orchestrate, but it's women like her that make sure that things stick and that change continues long after our shadows have stopped gracing their doors. And so as we partner with these local organizations, as we understand what each of us are very good at doing, for example, we as a church are really good at mobilizing people. We're good at inspiring, creating inspiring images and mobilizing families to action. But we're not very good at doing other things. We're not very good at vaccinating people, for example. That's a clinical service. We're not very good at providing supplementation. There's others whose core competency became that. We might be very good at teaching a family how to cook a nutritious meal. And we can lean on women's organizations within our own church to do that, not just with the families in the church, but also with the families in the community. We can open the doors of our churches, of our community centers, and teach dietary change. Things that are at the reach of families today, we can teach that. We can have men within the church's organizations teach people how to dig a garden, how to supplement their food intake of particular and especially of nutrient-rich foodstuffs. But again, we're not very good at providing deworming. And why is it important to have an ecosystemic view of things is because we could feed a child in a disadvantaged situation a steady diet of nutrient-rich foods, but if we don't deal with the worms that they get out of their dirty water, it's still going to be a problem tomorrow. And that's why these partnerships are so powerful and so important for us. And it is so inspiring to watch them at work. I sat across a group of, in this case, there were church members, but there are also people in the community, in a hall in the Philippines. And this was, I believe, in Cebu, and please forgive me if I'm imprecise about that. And we were talking about the types of interventions necessary to help these families. And one of these women stood up, and she spoke about her role as a member of this women's organization. And she said, you know, at first this was a bit of a challenge for us. It was difficult. It was kind of hated it to be asked to go and visit these families of these children who had been screened and found to be undernourished. Then I kind of started learning to tolerate it. You know, it wasn't so much of a burden. I started understanding what my role was. And finally, I've learned to love it. I learned to love this family. And ultimately, that is the type of change that's going to change things. It's the type of action that's going to change things. It's when we're motivated by love, things change. And I'm really grateful for opportunities like that to witness that change. And all of us have an opportunity to be part of that, to think globally, to understand what's happening around us outside of these walls, certainly outside of this state and this country. Understand what's happening. Why are people eating bat meat? Why are people eating bush meat? Why are they putting humanity at risk? Well, they're doing that because that's all they have. And the more we learn about their experience, the closer we get to the human experience, the more likely we are to be able to affect change. So think globally and then act locally. We have families in our community that go without, and you don't have to go very far to find them. Get involved with a food bank. Work for a pantry. Understand what's happening. Just Serve, which is the church's mechanism to mobilize volunteers in communities. I was looking at this last night, in fact. There's 140 active Just Serve projects just focused on food security in Utah Valley and Salt Lake Valley. 140. Go find one. Get with it. Be part of that change. And that change starts with you here today. Really, really grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit of the work we do as a church, and certainly the wonderful work we observe our partners in our local communities. Really thank you for the opportunity to share this with you today.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really inspiring. Serve with love, worrying about our neighbors and work globally to make changes locally. I hope I remember right the way you said it, but that's really what struck me. My name is Yvonne Nsabimana, and I will speak to you as a human on the human perspective, really. I've been touched by hunger many times in my life. I founded an organization called Ngoma Africa Culture Center when I moved to Utah for the second time in 2016, and I was a student trying to get an education so that I can be able to provide with my husband a future for our children, a future for ourselves, knowing that we both came from circumstances that were really hard. Personally, I grew up, both parents, they grew up from they came from very poor families. However, they had learned to work really hard. They had learned to work the field. Agriculture was a part of their daily life. And they've taught us a lot of skills. They've taught me a lot of skills from knowing to really be self-reliant with what you have. If you have little, just use it wisely. If you don't have any, work hard towards it. So my first time I came across hunger, I was a kid, when my dad took me to his village in Ruhengeri, in Rwanda. I saw kids who had almost no clothes and who were begging on the streets. And I couldn't understand, because at that time I was in a family that had we were not lacking anything at that time. My parents had worked hard, came, in a very higher rank level in the society. So we had really everything. We were in that privileged class, societal class. And I remember being touched by those kids. However, those kids were always happy and they were always dancing, which is one of the reasons I love to dance. And I remember talking to my parents and trying to understand why these kids, later on, I also saw the same kids who were this time refugees after we had a war. I couldn't understand why we have internally displaced refugees inside of our country when some of us are wealthy and having a great life. So I had to understand, obviously, that humans, we are the same. If you don't live through challenges yourselves, you don't understand and you don't relate. And this is one of the reasons when I founded this nonprofit, Ngoma Africa Culture Center, where we try to bring the people together from different cultures and perspectives to kind of understand first each other so they can befriend and being able to be sensitive to the needs of each other. That is where it started, really. So that was, as I said, the first time I saw hunger, seeing those kids and not understanding why they're going through that. However, my family, I remember my parents, again, I told you they grew up from a very poor circumstances, and my dad's home that he used to take us until he died in 1994, they had no water in the home. They had no electricity. We had to go remote to go to the restroom, jumping. I'll spare you the details. So I feel like one thing that is important that I'm trying to make here a point is education. So if we didn't have that education from my parents at that time, even if we had everything, we wouldn't have been able to thrive later when we became refugees, our turn, right? So because of conflict, as you guys know, it's a problem that is related to many things. Conflict in the world, the lack of water. I mean, there are a lot of things that are related, but the biggest one for me, it's poverty and conflict that brings hunger in this world. So for us, when I had to learn to be hunger my turn, it was when I was a refugee. So we had this war going on for 4 years, as I told you. I've seen these people who've been hungry, and I didn't know how this happened, and it happened to us. When it happened to us, we were lucky because there were organizations that helped us. And this is where, as you say, at the larger scale, I mean, there are things that each organization knows how to do. We were helped by this larger scale organization. UNHCR is the one that fed us for a couple of days when we didn't have anything as refugees. And I'm grateful for that. And later, this is what drove me to, obviously, to be wanting to be an activist in these things. So that was really the time I went through hunger, but it didn't end there. I had to witness hunger in America. And Belgium when I was a refugee in Belgium. So my family fled to Belgium. We arrived there. Obviously, we had lost everything. We had to start from scratch. We had nothing. When we fled, I left with my red pants that I loved very much, that eventually broke later, and a shirt. And that was it. We didn't even have time to take anything. We get to Belgium, we had to start over. Not only it was challenging to be in a new culture, in a new place, and I remember going to school, I was 13, and I would see those kids. Sometimes I didn't have enough money to even buy lunch for myself, or buy that beautiful waffle that I really wanted to eat for a snack during recess. So I remember my mom, again, and I'm really grateful for my mom. She's my hero. I would never cease to say that. My mom, who, as I told you, came from very poor circumstances, was wealthy, and then the war erupted. She had her own business. I mean, we were really in a good situation. And then she lost everything, but she didn't give up. Her mindset was, you guys, I've told you that you can come from poor to become wealthy and vice versa, right? So at that time, she had to tell us, you guys, you got to have a skill so you can be able to provide for yourself. And me and my sisters, we started braiding hair to make a little bit of extra income, because herself, she couldn't, so she finished high school, but she did have her own business and she had really become worthy, but she didn't have something like an education that could be sufficient to provide for those 6 kids that she fled with. So we learned a skill, we got an education. She always stressed on that. So education is really key, not only to create awareness, but also to be able to have opportunities in the future to provide for yourself. So she pushed us until this day. All of my siblings, we all graduated. We have our degrees and we're able to provide for our families. But if she would have given up, we wouldn't be able to provide for ourselves. We would be hungry. Today, there are a lot of people who are hungry, as you're saying. I've seen that in Louisiana, which was the first place I went to in America. I couldn't believe it. I went to some areas and I saw people who had no roof on their head, who had on their house, and who had nothing, really, literally nothing. I was like, this cannot be. Even in Africa, the poverty I saw wasn't as much as what I saw in America. And it's later that I understood that there's also this inequality problem going on. In America, obviously, and all over the world, it's the same thing. So if we address those different problems of inequality, of education equity, of helping communities to thrive, especially the vulnerable communities, which are refugees and immigrants who come and who are eager to make a better future. They know on the other side. Yesterday when we went to that panel, our girl said, they come to work twice harder because they know on the other side the grass is not greener. So myself, second time I became hungry, it was in America when we were students. We had such a little income and we had these restrictions of 20 hours working for my husband. Myself, I couldn't work with the visa I had. And I would never be ashamed to say that. I'm grateful again for my mom who had told us to make meals with the little we have. I had to buy a lot of cabbage. Cabbage is cheap, guys, and it's healthy. Potatoes, I will always cook a lot of cabbage and potatoes and maybe a meat every once in a while. I remember walking down the street next to UVU. We used to live next to UVU. I took the trolley from the store, from Walmart, going up and down the hill with it, because I didn't have a car at that time. And I was like, I'm not gonna give up. I have children to feed. At that time, I had 2 kids. So those different realities I'm sharing with you are still happening today. A lot of us are still going through this. A lot of families who come here that Ngoma Africa we're able to serve are going through that. And so when we created this space, this nonprofit that has been there for 6 years, not only we wanted to create a space for those families to be like they belong, because if you don't feel like you belong, you don't get any further in your life. You will be trying to get an education or a job, and a lot of us come with a heavy load of trauma. So if you don't have a place where you feel like you belong, then forget about everything else. So that was the first thing when I came here. I was like, where is my space? And I would befriend people, and they're not really my friend. I'm like, the culture is so different. I mean, it was really, really, I had to go through a depression one day to really realize that something is not adding up in this equation. I'm closing myself, and I'm not doing what I can do as a person. So that's why I started volunteering and created a nonprofit. First, we helped kids who were adopted by families here who also themselves couldn't belong anywhere. And so why we gave that confidence to these families, and we still do, then they can talk about the problems they have. Then we can provide the resources. Then we can partner with different organizations. We partner a lot with the refugee organization that is based here. I remember going and make visits, volunteer to interpret in Kinyarwanda, because they needed someone they can kind of relate to and speak, and they can have someone translate for them. And I was so heartbroken here in Utah, seeing families still hungry. And luckily, there are a lot of partners, there are a lot of organizations. The food pantry, something I'm familiar with. So I think this is definitely a grassroots problem and also a global problem. And all of us can make a difference. We can make a difference by sustaining organizations that are doing work on a smaller scale and a larger scale. Our performers, our organization has about 60 plus people every year who come and give their talent to us. So what we do, we not only promote the African culture, but we also give them that space. We give them the space they can come and belong and share with the community, so the community can realize that we are humans, we have a human experience, we have a culture that is kind of similar, even if we are different. And then these people, they are able to, in return, receive scholarships. We've started that too. We give scholarships to our students, who are international students, who cannot go and work, obviously, because there are restrictions. We give rental assistance to some families who like, oh my goodness, I'm lacking $100 or $200. Okay, well, come to our organization, give the time, work with us, help the community so they can learn about you and Africa, that Africa is not just what we saw on TV, that people are hungry and starve and have wars. We have the beauty we can share. And as we relate to that beautiful human experience together, that's when you open the hearts. You touch that heart that wants to love and help your neighbor. Thank you. I mean, I could go on and on.
Thank you. As you can see, we do have some mighty panelists here, and grateful that they have taken time to spend with us today. I'll open this discussion with the first question, and then if there's somebody in the audience, we'll turn the time over. Let me ask my question and we'll answer, and then we'll come to you. Thank you. So let's just dream for a second and say that you have all been asked by Secretary General Antonio Guterres to come and work in his office on the issue of global hunger and malnutrition. And you were his expert consultant. In 1 to 2 sentences, or maybe 3 to 4 sentences, or a paragraph, just take a second and tell us what would you encourage the Secretary General to do to think about solutions? What are some solutions to this problem of allocation, access, technology? What would you say to him about solutions? Rebecca, let's start with you, and then...
I'll just go last.
You want to go last?
It's unfair that I've been in the UN for many years.
Okay, great. You can go last. Luis, let's start with you, and then Yvonne, and then Rebecca.
Wow, Secretary Guterres is a Portuguese just like I am. I would probably invite him for some sardines over and have some conversation about this. This is such a daunting task. This SDG is so daunting. This idea of eradicating hunger in humankind, and we like to think of ourselves as a enlightened society that can eventually get there. I would tell Secretary Guterres to be patient, to have patience with the process. I sat recently with an expert on human hunger and malnutrition, and he said that generally speaking, it will be 10 to 15 years before you start any given intervention, before you start seeing change. And I would say, let's be patient. I would say, let's care for the immediate need. And let's not look at means. Let's not look at anything but just to relieve the immediate need. And it's not just about relieving need, and that's certainly important. And Maslow would say, feed them first, and we should. But then it's also about creating sustainable conditions. For those sustainable conditions to take root and to eventually provide fruit, it takes patience. It takes long-term care. It takes sustained learning together and teaching together. I would say Secretary Guterres to go and visit the hotspots, to become deeply aware of the circumstances of families, to understand that these, again, are broad problems that require broad interventions. I would tell him to identify the key strategic partnerships that UN agencies such as UNICEF, again, communities of faith, secular organizations and local organizations can play, and understand how to put them in a place where they can do the best work that they can do. And learn how to build those ecosystems in order to effect change in the ground. And then I tell him to pray. As a man of faith, I consider that this is a Christian mandate, but it's more than just a Christian mandate. It's a Muslim mandate. It's a Buddhist mandate. Name your religion. Every decent human will look at this as a human mandate. And I would pray. I would ask for guidance. I would ask for ways, just to think outside the box. I'd ask for ways to bring solace to these most vulnerable communities, especially when we're talking about the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable in our communities. It's children, it's women, and those of age. And not a simple answer not a simple question, but most of all, I would say, let's be patient.
Great. Thank you. Yvonne, go ahead.
Well, I was reading on some of the goals already the UN is working on, and I did really take away a few of them that are really important, that I think I would just remind him that they exist and that we can work together as organizations worldwide. So they're talking about empowering small farmers, and I feel like this is so critical. Sometimes I wonder why Africa, we have such a rich soil, okay? So for me, when I see people who are hungry in a rich soil like that, sometimes it doesn't add up. And then you realize there are things behind, right? There are conflicts, as I said, if people are displaced from their homes, and then they are living in fear, and they're also sometimes coerced by the government not to even work their farm, obviously it becomes a problem. So small farmers are critical into stopping hunger in the world. In Rwanda, I remember growing up there, a lot of people, as I said, had their own farm, and they would live from what they have in the soil. Sometimes, again, as I said, I don't understand. How can we be hungry when we have such a rich soil? I have a garden in Utah, and sometimes, I mean, when I have to remove all those rocks and all the work, I'm like, what? In Rwanda, you will put a seed. 2 weeks later, the food is already there. I mean, things just grow. So by sustaining those farmers and promoting agriculture, that is definitely one critical thing. And then you have to work hand in hand. I would tell him that UN is marvelous into getting involved into stopping conflict. In Rwanda, again, before we had the war, before my dad was assassinated, we were working towards a peace agreement in our country. And that peace agreement was pushed by UN. So being involved in those initiatives will be so wonderful. Continue working towards those initiatives. That peace agreement obviously didn't go through. That's why we ended up having a genocide in Rwanda and a lot of people dying. So conflict, again, definitely will be something I'll tell him, like, have a good eye on that. Communicate, teach good leadership, teach ethical governing in whatever capacity you can to help in those countries. Those are the two things I feel like I would tell him.
Great, thank you.
That would be a tough situation for me because I spent most of my professional life with UNICEF and with UNDP addressing these issues. And what I would like to say to this audience here is that in fact the UN is doing a lot of work already to strengthen governance institutions, because that's part of the issue here, to address the structural problems. It's working to ensure that children are vaccinated. It's working to ensure that women have opportunities, equal opportunities, and are not excluded from policy making. That women, when you bring women to the table, and I'm sure you agree here, when you bring women to the table in decision-making processes, the whole paradigm shifts. And it's very, very effective to include women in addressing hunger, for example. But I can't tell the UN Secretary General anything new because he was heading UNHCR that addresses refugees. He knows firsthand what the refugee situation looks like. He also knows firsthand how difficult it is to address conflict, which is one of the drivers, along with weak institutions, governance institutions, along with all the population displacement that we're seeing in an unprecedented manner. So he knows all of that. So what can I tell them that's new? Or that there's no magic bullet that I'm sorry to say. I can't tell him to be patient because I don't think he can be patient. We are in a very, very difficult situation now in the world. I don't think we can have a lot of patience. I think we have to be much more proactive, get many more partners on board at all levels, and I'm really glad that you spoke today about the hunger in this country. Because, the UN for years was misunderstood in the United States. I have been on radio talk radio, whatever, discussing children's rights, for example, and a lot of people have come on with questions and were so misinformed about the work of the UN, I couldn't believe it. We need to educate others about, the work that's happening. All you hear sometimes on the media, through the media here, is the terrible things or the things that the UN is not doing. But in fact, if you look at development issues, the UN is doing a phenomenal job in getting access to water and sanitation, ensuring access to water and sanitation in the area of education, in the area of addressing poverty and many other wonderful things, but you don't hear about it. I'd just like to take one thing, I have to promote this, and that is the SDG 16 is the goal, right, of ensuring that there's justice and strong institutions and so forth. But one of the targets of 16.2, one of the targets is 16.2. The goal, 16 has a target, and many targets, right? 16.2 is ending violence against children. And that was a dramatic, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because the fact that it's even a target is a remarkable achievement. In order to get these sustainable development goals to be adopted by the international community was a huge undertaking. And what I loved about it is that when they developed the Millennium Development Goals, which were 8 goals, which included poverty and ending hunger, civil society was not included. Civil society was not consulted for the Millennium Development Goals that were to be achieved by 2015. So we were running around all during the 90s talking about the MDGs and were we going to achieve them? And we were saying they're all human rights. These are all human rights that we have to promote because they're not just goals, they're also human rights to be, respected and protected and so forth. But now they're SDGs, and the civil society had a huge engagement. That's the really great thing about the UN, is that they made a difference when they adopted the SDGs to include civil society. So it was the most participatory. I mean, it was amazing. Even the World Bank got involved. Now, listen, this is important because when the World Bank gets involved in anything, everybody else listens, you know. We were saying a lot of the same things at UNICEF, but when the World Bank gets engaged, it's like governments listen. So back to the issue of what would I say to the UN Secretary General? I would say, look, we've been at this a long time. We had the MDGs, we haven't achieved them, we now have the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's use UNICEF as a great example because UNICEF was a great mobilizer and advocate for children. Let's start with the children and let's engage because when you talk about children, people forget their differences and come together. You know that the first World Summit for children, first World Summit was for children in 1990. And everybody said, it's never going to happen. You're not going to get heads of state to come together in one day in New York at the UN to address children's issues. It's never going to happen. And you know, there were more than 100 leaders, including people like Margaret Thatcher. I mean, there were all kinds of leaders that came together to address children's issues. So when we are talking about these issues of achieving these goals, let's try to bring people together, bring those that may not be your obvious partners, but like-minded partners, and work together. UNICEF has done extraordinary things like that to ensure vaccination, for example. And so I'm very inspired by your work, by the way. I wanted to just say that before I say anything. I'm very inspired by your work because you have been very courageous, very resilient, and I respect you. Thank you.
Thank you. Did we have a question back here? Please come up and ask your question.
Hello, everybody. I am Masoud Nouri, the representative of Imam Organization at the UN, which is a Shia Muslim organization for religious and humanitarian aids in the North America and Middle East. You said that I cannot make a statement, but one sentence. The people that around the world suffering and even died by overeating are more than people suffering from hunger. So it's very important issue to think about that, why we have this phenomenon in our world. The second issue, which is the question, 29th of September, remarked by UN as the day about wasting foods. And the FAO says that 17% of total global food production is wasted. What do you think about this percentage of food? Is it good idea to solve this problem? And it can help a lot for hunger problem. The second question is that, what do you think about a campaign including UN agencies, academic, religious, and other civil society? The question or the request for this campaign reduce 1% of military budget of every country and give it to FAO, to UNDP, to UNICEF, to solve this problem. Just 1% of military budget, including this huge country. What do you think about this question?
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yvonne, let's turn that question to you. We have about 5 minutes before we have to break. Before we answer that, is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? Okay, Yvonne, why don't you answer that question, then we'll turn the time over to this gentleman here and let him ask his question as well.
So I hope I understood your questions. I remember the second question. The first one I don't remember. You were asking, what do you think about having 1% of military budget turning into the hunger problem in the world? And then you spoke about something about food that is being wasted every day, right? Why not using that to address the problem. I think some of that is already addressed. The food waste is a huge problem, obviously, in America. I saw that myself. And I'm grateful for organizations that have been jumped in and that do food pantry, and they have actually this second kind of distribution system where they give these food to people who don't have enough food. And I've seen that, and I think this is such a good and very genius and very innovative way of not wasting food. And these kind of initiatives, I think, should be encouraged more and more. Because if you look at, we overproduce food in this country. And it doesn't make any sense. Even in school cafeterias, I taught school for 6 years. You look at the garbage. I'm like, why? Why do we waste so much food every day? There's a way to, first of all, I think we need to stop overproducing food. That's the first thing. Second thing, and it's not even healthy food, by the way, all the time. Let's just say that. Why not teaching every population, every person to be self-reliant by making their own, like have a farm? And anyway, don't get me there. But what I'm trying to say is we need to push initiatives, food pantries in every corner of America so that those who cannot afford the food, they go and get that food. It doesn't make any sense to waste it. As for the military allocation, I agree with you. That goes to that problem I've been trying to talk about. We need less conflicts in the world. And by encouraging those through military and whatever, resources and logistics that go with it, obviously that's not going to end it. I feel like we should be worried more about those problems versus conflicts to be increased or being more focused on that problem.
Great, thank you. Okay, go ahead, please.
Hello. I'll try to formulate this question as best I can. In my international relations class, one thing we've learned is that primarily in Africa, a lot of the contention, a lot of the conflict is based off because they were colonies that were formed and that people didn't get to kind of structure their own countries themselves. So I guess my question would be, is it possible, or do you think that, because hearing that a lot of places in Africa have such great soil, they could grow their own food, they could have the means to be self-sufficient as far as food goes. Would it be possible, like from a UN standpoint, from the world standpoint, to restructure or redraw the lines of those countries to the way that the people want them? Would that help conflict go away, or would that, in a democratic way, similar to like India, Gandhi, they kind of redrew their lines. Now India's,
Can I ask you a question? Do you know the Treaty of Berlin? Have you heard about that?
Yes.
If you don't, yeah.
A little bit, but
So
I don't know.
why redefining frontières or borders when people themselves, they have known how to organize themselves for centuries and many years? That is actually one of the heritage problematic that we have in Africa. It's colonization and slavery, obviously, that also touched the African American population. So for me, the way I address that problem, that I feel like we can all address it, is first of all, learn from history and not repeat the same mistakes.
Great. Okay, one last question, and then we'll wrap up. Right here. And let us know your name and where you're from.
I'm not Muslim. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but I do, within Islam, usury is supposed to be prohibited, and so you have what's called participatory banking, and especially in some banks in Turkey and things like that, where you could have a sliding equity or a shared ownership within a business product. I do know that, generally speaking, that we use microloans, which I actually oppose that to some extent, because I don't believe we should be benefiting off of the lives of the poor. So I'm wondering if it's possible to set up a shared, what you call a shared stewardship within that banking model that you see in Islam, to basically co-manage micro enterprises and smallhold farms in Middle East and Latin America, South America, and then you're able to scale a stewardship model outside of religious context.
Thank you for your question. Luis, would you like to?
Microfinancing is a phenomena that is changing the world in a lot of different areas, starting in India. And these are great concepts. And it is about local community empowerment. It's not so much about macroeconomics. It's not so much about geopolitical discussions. It's about local empowerment, local organizations managing local assets, sharing ownership of those assets. And we very much see promise in those models in something that would be worth pursuing. And then, you know, it goes back to empowering local farmers, local producers, local distributors to meet the needs of their local communities. Not every humanitarian crisis requires a global enforcement or a global element. A lot of answers to the problems are going to start right there, usually within a 10-mile radius. And if local communities learn to leverage the assets, the resources that have been provided to them, some of the root causes, not all of the root causes. Of course, for example, when you talk about undernourishment and you talk about micronutrient insufficiencies, micronutrients have to occur naturally in ecosystems, and sometimes they just don't. There are areas where iron may not be present, and at that point you necessitate an outside agency to bring in those resources. But again, most problems faced by these local communities can have solutions within a 50-mile radius, if we just empower them to do so. Jean Bingham, former Relief Society president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, used to say this, and I love this statement about her. One of the things she said so frequently was this concept of unleashing the power of women. That is it. It's empowering women to make a difference in their communities. And unfortunately, they tend to be the last ones whose opinions we ask. And so getting them at the forefront of the solution is really, really critical.
Okay, I think Rebecca has one comment that she wants to make, and then we will wrap up this
Yes.
discussion.
No, it would not be fair for me to go away and not mention the microcredit schemes that the United Nations Development Program has been supporting for a long time. And this is at the grassroots, particularly in the area of agriculture. Those microcredit schemes, I think you should look into by going to the UN Development Program website. And it makes me remember this amazing story about these indigenous women in Brazil. And these indigenous women in Brazil decided to they were making hammocks, these wonderful hammocks. And the chiefs, the men in the village, didn't think much of what they were doing until suddenly an NGO came around and said, oh my gosh, we love these hammocks. Can we start producing them and selling them all over the world? These women suddenly had a vehicle to get those hammocks all over the world, and they started making all this money. And then the village men got very upset about it because they were totally excluded. That created another problem. But the women really were very productive and were able to do something really extraordinary. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you all for your attendance, and good luck on the rest of your conference.
I love the work the church does. I wasn't the one that